Good morning to everybody. I'm Özkal, and today we're going to talk about the lexical approach at length. So let's start. First of all, the founding father of lexical approach is Michael Lewis, and he developed lexical approach in 1993. Actually, in those years, even in today, there are a lot of textbooks which follow a grammar-based syllabus. So, lexical approach is an alternative to grammar-based approaches. And as the name actually suggests, lexis and the words and the vocabulary is the basis of language and plays the central role in this approach. Chunks, minimal pairs, collocations, and the lexical units are the specific characteristics of this approach. And these are all parts of the lexis of any language. And for Michael Lewis, the language instruction actually should focus on fixed expressions that frequently occur in spoken language. And we can give some examples like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you, or that will never happen to me, rather than on originally created sentences. And when we focus on the last line here, it says rather than on originally created sentences. When we think of it, actually, this looks like conflicting with Chomsky's universal grammar theory. If we remember the universal grammar hypothesis, Chomsky says that humans can create an infinite number of sentences with a finite set of rules. So, because of the human creativity, humans can produce sentences that they have never heard before or that has been never said before. So, but Michael Lewis, in contrast to Chomsky, says that only a minority of spoken sentences are entirely new, and chunks and the multi-word units it means form a majority of everyday conversation. So Michael Lewis says that when we're talking or speaking to each other, usually we are speaking through some fixed expressions, and we're going to learn about that a few slides later. For example, when we see the word relative, possibly we don't use it in isolation. Possibly we expect to hear before the word relative, blood, close, distant, and near. Near relative, distant relative, or close relative. Or when we see the word learn, possibly we want to combine it while speaking. Learn by doing, learn by heart, learn by observation, learn by rote, or learn from experience. And when we talk about hurt, we usually expect to be preceded by badly hurt, bitterly hurt, deeply hurt, seriously hurt, or severely hurt. And the last but not the least, commit usually is followed by some nouns like commit suicide, commit crime, commit an error, commit murder, or commit adultery. Or it's not only actually about the words in spoken language. We can usually see some chunks in the songs as well. For example, there are some fixed phrases like I want you. As you see, this chunk has been used in the songs of many artists or singers. Or the world, or the fixed phrase around the world, call me, drive me crazy, or money talks. This kind of idioms like drive me crazy and money talks. They are also frequently used, as you see, in the songs of many singers. Not only in English, also when we think about our own language, keyfine bak has been used many times in the songs of some particular singers and bands. Also, with the advent of the technology, also there have been added some chunks to our mental lexicon, like add to chart, especially when we're doing shopping through the internet, advanced search, create an account, download the link, frequently asked questions, privacy policy, shipping policy, sign up or sign in, or sitemap, they are all chunks. I mean, the multi-words unit, which consists of 2 or more words coming together. So, when we think of all these examples, for example, when you go to a doctor, the doctor asks you, for example, what's the matter with you? And then possibly you're going to answer with, I have blah, blah, blah. And then possibly he's going to say, okay, now I am going to prescribe you some pills and go to a chemist and use them properly or take them properly. And then the patient is going to say possibly, thanks a lot and see you. So it doesn't differ so much when you do the shopping in a clothes shop, for example. Or for example, the shopkeeper is going to tell you, going to ask you actually, what are you looking for? And then possibly you are going to say, I'm asking for or I'm looking for blah, blah, blah. And then she's going to ask you, what size do you want? And then you're going to say medium, large, or whatever. And then when you go to the cashier desks, the cashier, the man or the woman in the cashier desk possibly gonna ask you, how would you like to pay? And you're gonna say, by credit card or by cash. So even our dialogues seems to consist of some fixed expressions or some conversational gambits. And when we think about the approach, the theoretical underpinnings of lexical approach, the building blocks of language learning and communication are not grammar, functions, or some unit of planning, but teaching lexes with the help of chunks and collocations. So Michael Lewis is not only mentioning lexes by saying only vocabulary or single word items. He usually means the chunks and the collocations. Although there are some differences between chunks and collocations, now we can think them as synonymous at this point. Language consists of grammaticalized lexes, not lexicalized grammar. So this sentence is like the slogan of lexical approach. So Michael Lewis talks about grammaticalized lexes, which means we should use grammar to connect the words which are linked together in terms of semantics, rather than just writing or using some vocabulary items while we are teaching grammar. So this is the change in mentality. So rather than focusing on grammar, the language instruction should focus on vocabulary items. Chunks are an essential feature of naturalistic languages. As we have just mentioned, you can see the fixed structures or patterns while we are talking in daily life or while we are listening to songs. And knowledge of chunks is an important factor that contributes to fluent speech. And lexical approach sees that the key to fluent speech is to use these multi-word units actually. And language ability requires producing language through syntactic generation, which is grammar, and using lexical chunks in appropriate situations. So when he says appropriate situations, he also makes some references to the pragmatics through the use of lexes. When we continue to talk about the approach, the lexical approach makes a distinction between two traditional notions, vocabulary and lexes. When we talk about vocabulary, it's actually an individual word with fixed meaning. However, when we talk about lexes, it's not only the single words, but also the word combination which exists in our mental lexicons. So, instead of words, the lexical approach suggests, we consciously try to think of collocations and to present this in our expressions. We try to frequently use them in our daily life to continue or sustain our conversation. Rather than trying to break things into even smaller pieces, there is a conscious effort to see the things in larger, more holistic ways. So we can just, considering this, we can just conclude that lexical approach is an inductive approach to language learning. So the learners first gonna perceive the chunks as a whole, and then they are going to question and divide them or break down into smaller parts. And then when they want to make new sentences, they are going to make use of this information. And what do we mean by saying chunks or multi-word units? Actually, we can list them under 10 categories, basically. And they are, the first 5 consist of binomials, trinomials, idioms, similes, and connectives. What we mean by saying binomials are the words which are connected with and, which consist of, as the name, as the prefix by suggests, 2 words. For example, knife and fork, clean and tidy, sooner or later, or pros and cons, which are usually found together and we use them back to back. Although not as frequently as used as binomials, the trinomials also exist in the language. For example, tall, dark, and handsome, bag, steal, or borrow. So trinomials consist of 3 words. Idioms, which are also covered in many of the textbooks, like to rain cats and dogs, to be devil's advocate when somebody is making a counter-argument, or a piece of cake when something is very easy. Also, there are similes which consist of chunks, like if something is purely clean, you say as white as snow, or if something is really hard, you say as hard as a rock. Or if there is dead silence, if something is really, really silent, we say as silent as the dead. And the connectives that we usually find together, like finally, to conclude, firstly, in addition, to illustrate. And these are the first 5 multi-word units. And when we come to the second 5, we can see the conversational gambits, which we make use of very frequently during our conversation. Like, guess what? Or, excuse me, or let me put it another way. And there are some discourse markers which connects the discourse, the supersentential patterns into each other, like on the other hand. And the compounds, again, middle-aged, densely populated, narrow-minded, and well-behaved. In that sense, maybe we can confuse these middle-aged, densely populated, narrow-minded, which also consist of 2 words, but are not actually, when we just go back to the previous ones, they are not like binomials, because in binomials we usually just connect them with the conjunction and. That's the difference. And the proverbs also are composed of multi-word units, like better late than never, or the early bird catches the worm, and finally, easy come, easy go. And there are some exclamation patterns, like you must be kidding, or you will never guess, or how nice. So, as you see, in our daily life or in our daily conversation, we frequently make use of them. So that helps us to be more fluent in language speaking according to the lexical approach. And when we talk about the theory of learning, the lexical approach suggests that learners will encounter new items when they study the language or when they encounter language items, especially lexes. And one of the most important things for the students is to notice lexical chunks or collocations which are frequently used in daily conversation or in reading text. And noticing those similarities, differences, and the restrictions and the examples are also important when learning the language. For example, when we see the words or 2 words which are similar to each other as a chunk, then first the students notice them. And then it looks like there are differences between these into chunks. And then there are restrictions between the words which may not come back to back. And there are also examples. And for Michael Lewis, acquisition is based not on applying former rules, which is the grammar, but making temporary generalizations from previously made examples. As we remember from the previous slides, in contrast to UG hypothesis, the people's mental lexicon usually consists of some rules or some generalizations that they encounter previously, and then the learners test their hypotheses and try to guess which words comes back to back and then form a unified mental lexicon. And when we go on to theory of learning, the theory of chunks can be facilitated through in 4 ways. One of them is to notice. The learners should first notice the lexical chunks in a spoken or written text, like paying attention to the chunks in the input, whether they are spoken input or written input. And then the second stage is the cognitive processing. You can actually guess from the title or this category, that the name of the category, that cognitive processing means elaborating the chunks in the student's mind to achieve retention, so that they can just transfer their new knowledge into their long-term memory to be remembered later on. And the third one is the exposure. For lexical approach, the more frequent encounters with the words are, the better learning is. So, in that sense, it looks like questions, input hypothesis, like if there is a lot of input, then the learners will receive that input and just change their knowledge according in the light of this input. And there are also, and for question, the emphasis on reading and listening, because the input is mainly depending on reading and listening. And other suggestions for this one is making classroom a laboratory via concordance databases. Actually, a few slides later on, we are going to talk about what concordance is. And there will be some software packages in the classrooms, and students are expected to use these software to notice these lexical chunks. And of course, the comparisons with L1, between the languages, there are many similar collocations, actually. However, the teachers should usually focus on the ones which may not have direct translational equivalence between 2 languages. And when we come to how the syllabus is proposed in lexical approach, Michael Lewis suggests that no linear syllabus can adequately reflect the non-linear nature of acquisition. So learning a language is usually in a fluctuation pattern. And if the students or if the teachers follow a linear syllabus, then it may not reflect the real nature of acquisition. So, rather than just first focusing on the retrospective syllabus, now let's come to the lexical syllabus first. So, Michael Lewis suggests a lexical syllabus. So, what is lexical syllabus at this point? Corpus-based syllabus, including single words and chunks. So, corpus is a large body of words that can be found in a language, and one of the most common corpus in English is the Cambridge English Corpus, or Bank of English, which has been carried by the Collins Cobalt. And according to this lexical syllabus, rather than on if the syllabus is going to follow something, it should focus on the lexes and the verbs and the collocations. However, this lexical chunk or these lexes or the vocabulary items should not only focus on the teacher's intuition or the researcher's thoughts. Instead, it should depend on real data and the realities in daily life. So, by following the corpus-based data, then the curriculum developers can base their syllabus in the light of this scientific data. And another kind of syllabus which is proposed by this lexical approach is the retrospective syllabus. And what is that? It's an organized record of the chunks that learners have encountered in different written and spoken tests. Because there are potentially a number of multi-words units, and because they cannot be predicted beforehand, learners should be aware of the chunks while structuring them, storing those items, those lexical items, and using them in their speech or in written word. So, in this sense, it's like a retrospective, which depends on the previous knowledge. As we will see, the students are expected to keep a vocabulary notebook here. And when they keep a vocabulary notebook, then their syllabus will eventually develop, and it will act as a syllabus for them too. So, what are the aims, or what is the aim of lexical approach? One of them is to get students to become aware of, use, and eventually master chunks, collocations, and fixed utterances. This is the main aim or the major principle of lexical approach. The students should be able to use collocations and fixed utterances in their sentences. And the second objective can be to help learners identify and learn the chunks in spoken and written text. As you see, throughout lexical approach, we usually see the words like the word chunks, the vocab, the multi-word units. This is the most critical part in lexical approach, actually. And language is learned inductively by breaking down wholes into parts. So, as we suggested, or as we talked just a few slides before, lexical approach is an inductive approach to language teaching, because they think the proponents of lexical approach believe that over time learners will disassemble, will break down the multi-words and then analyze them to make new utterances. And when we come to learning and teaching activities, what kind of activities or what kind of learning is proposed in lexical approach? And let's see them. There are actually 4 categories that we can talk about. First, awareness activities, and then training in text chunking, and then memory enhancing activities, and finally retelling. When we mean awareness activities, we see that students should first notice of the chunks via corpora and concordances. As we have suggested before, let's clarify this word. This is actually corpora is the plural form of the word corpus. Corpus is the singular and the corpora is the plural form. Corpus is actually, let's remember, corpus is the large body of words that exist in a language. And concordance lines can be explained like this. In concordance lines, the target word actually appears in the middle of the sentence. And you can see what is preceded or what is followed by the target word. For example, if a student just enters the word interested, he's or she's going to see interested in education, interested in the various skills, interested in, and then she can or he can make the generalization that interest, if I'm going to use interested, possibly I can add and I can use in right after it. But there are also places where I might not use the preposition in. Or when a student, when a learner just enters the word say, then he can see some sentences in produced in English, and he can look just the first two letters, the first two words, or the following words, and then understand what the word or what the verb in this context is about. For example, if he's going to see the say, then he will also notice, he will also recognize money, and then hundreds of dollars, time and money, here again money, and again here money, and all costs. Then he's going to make the deduction that if I use the word say, then it might be about something money. So these are the concordance lines. So all of them are the all lines, actually, all of them are called concordance lines. When we go back to our slide, so how should the students use these chunks, and how can they access to this kind of concordance lines or corpus? First, students will underline the multi-word units given in an authentic text provided by the teacher. And then they are going to compare them with those of their peers and the teachers. And finally, they are going to use online resources or dictionaries to check whether what they have found exists in corpus or not. However, after testing their hypothesis, they should be engaged in memory-enhancing activities. So how can this be possible? The elaboration of a term through spelling, pronunciation, parts of speech, meaning, associations, visual and motoric images. As remember, if somebody asks you, what does knowing a word mean? You cannot just say, if I know the meaning of the word, either in L2 or in L1, it doesn't necessarily mean that you know the word. For the word, if you want to say, I know this word, first, we should be able to write it, or pronounce it, or we should analyze it as whether it's an adjective, noun, adverb, or verb. Or, of course, maybe this is one of the most basic one, we should be able to tell what it means and what kind of connotations does it have. So what kind of verbs do we expect to be in that sentence or around that word? Also, visual and motoric images, because there are actually two ways, there are two tracks of input in our brain. One of them is the verbal track and the other one is the non-verbal track. We should be also able to just appeal to students' visual memory as well. So it's also important. And the final stage is retelling, like summarizing or retelling what they have read by using the same chunks that they have noticed or discovered during the text. And by practicing those chunks within their sentences, they will be able to hopefully remember them in their later sentences. So, what about the teacher's role then? Teacher seems to have a very active role in lexical approach because, first, teachers should be able to recognize multi-word units in their input, whether in a spoken input or in a written input. And then, the second one, assess which multi-word units, which chunks to teach in the classroom. And finally, use some text to teach chunks, because as we suggested beforehand, most of the input comes from the written text. And the other roles that is heaped on teachers' shoulders is to use computer software and corpora and implement database learning activities. So, as you remember from the previous slide, we have some concordance lines. And how can we reach them? Of course, through computer software. And rather than just telling or giving students some words which they think important, it may not work effectively because maybe students, maybe in their real life or in daily life spoken in English, there are some collocations or there are some chunks which are important, but the teacher may not know them. So, teacher should focus its instruction on this data-based results. And the talk of teacher is a major source of learner input, which is similar to Krashen's natural approach. So, in Krashen's natural approach, we possibly remember the input hypothesis. And in input hypothesis, the teacher talk is very important because in a classroom environment, which is surrounded by four walls, the most of the input comes from the teacher. So, teacher should make the students recognize these multiverse units or chunks in his or her speech or in written texts. Teachers need to implement the methodology, which is based on 3 stages. Possibly we're going to remember them from Gamze's presentation last week. This is also similar to task-based language teaching: task, planning, and report. So, in the light of all these sentences, we can conclude that teachers should abandon the idea of being a knower and concentrate on the idea of learners as a discoverer. Because the teacher in lexical approach has an active role, but it doesn't mean that he or she is going to do the all tasks or all teaching activities by himself. He's gonna possibly help the learners to discover the rules. So the learners will be the discoverer. And it's not that the teacher is the only knower in the classroom. The teacher only helps students to discover these multi-word units. And what are the students' roles? The student learners are both data and language analysts. Why data analysts? Because they are going to see the concordance lines and the corpus studies, and between those lines, they are going to choose the most suitable ones which suit their needs. And they will be also language analysts because they are going to analyze whether they are appropriate in the sentence that they're going to use. Learners observe, classify, and make generalizations based on the corpora studies. And they make use of concordance lines, as we said before. And they concordance training because the students may not know how to handle with this large body of data, and they need some training which will be provided by their teachers. And they should keep a vocabulary notebook. This is also underlined by one of the studies carried out by Norbert Schmidt with Japanese students, and they said that keeping a vocabulary notebook actually facilitates students' vocabulary knowledge. And in that sense, we see that the role of instructional materials is very important in lexical approach. Although there are not a lot of course books or courseware which depends on lexical approach, we can see some Touchstone series or Willis's Collins-Cobilt English course. And in those course books, usually students should focus on multiverse units or chunks while teaching those readings or the other parts. Also, teachers will need or students will need corpus-based materials because they are the scientific way of varying the chunks. And the corpora that can be used with concordancing software, because without concordancing software, all the data or all the language teaching just arises out of teachers' intuition about teaching language. And in that sense, the biggest corpora is the Bank of English, which is part of Collins' corpus that includes 650 million words in English, which is a really, really high number. And Collins' co-built English course, which was produced by Willis and Willis in 1989, was the most ambitious attempt to develop a lexical syllabus. As I said, it is very difficult to find some course books or courseware which really depends on lexical approach, because some people have criticized lexical approach being too demanding and it really consumes too much time. That's why some curriculum developers or coursebook developers didn't intend to focus so much on producing books which depends on lexical approaches principles. And how is the procedure carried out in lexical approach? First, the students notice the lexical phrases. Second one, the students record the newly learned items in their vocabulary notebooks, which seems to be effective and proved by empirical studies. And learning chunks is important not only inside the classroom but also outside the classroom. So students also, when they go out of the classroom, they should notice the vocabulary items which are around them and just keep them or record them in their vocabulary notebooks. And learners here are like discourse analysis, which analyze the lots of information which is provided in corpus studies or concordance lines. And if there are some lexical parts or multi-word units, they can be explicitly focused on lexical phrases. The teachers can explicitly focus on lexical phrases. As in most of the approaches, of course, there are some criticisms made against lexical approach. And the most basic criticism revolve around the issue of the fact that lexical approach lacks full characterization of an approach, and it doesn't have a detailed learning theory. In some of the approaches, we see that some of them is based on behavioristic approach, or some of them just emerge from the principles of humanistic approach. Here we see very little signs of a learning approach, learning theory. Actually, we can talk about learner autonomy because the students will be the discoverer and the teacher will be the facilitator. And the students will keep their notebook and arrange their syllabus by themselves. But this may not be enough just to claim that it has a deep learning theory. Also, implementing a lexical approach will produce learners whose speech is limited to cliches. Because what lexical approach puts forward is the idea that people can just talk through some fixed phrases or expressions. However, some researchers just question that, are we really producing in this way the learners or the speech which are limited to some fixed phrases and the cliches? And the claims for the effectiveness of a lexical syllabus aren't supported by empirical evidence. So there are actually very few studies, if any, which supports empirically the lexical approach. And finally, a lexical approach is already included in most communicative language learning approaches, and there is nothing new here. So that's really a big claim. It looks like they just disregard lexical approach as a separate one, rather they see it just an alternative to existing syllabuses actually. And to conclude, lexical approach has a lexically based theory of language that puts lexis, the words, at the heart of learning. And Teachers help learners to discover knowledge instead of giving it directly. So in this way, they foster learner autonomy. Intensive and extensive listening and reading are needed in the target language. Why? Because input is very important in lexical approach, and most of the input comes from listening and the reading materials. Because the students will see the lexical chunks in listening and reading text, and then after noticing them, they're going to discover or master them and use in their speech or in their written work. Guessing the meaning of vocabulary items from context is also important. You can understand it from the concordance lines because there are a lot of sentences, and students should be able to discriminate between the meaning of the words among those lines. Noticing and recording language patterns and collocations is important. And working with dictionaries and the other reference tools also important here. When we say other reference tools, we're talking about the corpora studies, concordance lines, and the course book, or any other input which is outside the classroom. And lexical approach can be an alternative approach, as the previous slides suggests. So that's the end of that's the end of our presentation. And we're going to talk about and do some practice work in the classroom. Hopefully, see you in the classroom. Goodbye from Denizli.